So we have our basic input, but right now it's just a presentational component in the end. It just takes some configuration here and then renders a nice looking input field and a label. Not too bad for sure, but also not all that I want. Instead, my idea is the following. And I really want to highlight that this is just one possible approach of doing this. But my idea is that in the input component here, we manage some internal state, we manage what the user entered, and we also manage whether what the user entered is valid or not. The answer to that question, whether it's valid or not, is provided with some external configuration. So when we use the input component here, for example in new place, I want to be able to pass in an array of validators, which of course has to be an array of some clearly defined values or objects or identifiers, which we pick up in input component, through which we then go inside of input component to find out whether the input is valid or not. And then we basically pass the information whether the input is valid and what the input actually was, so the concrete value entered, back to new place. With that pattern we already know, where we have something like on change here or on input or whatever you want, and then you simply pass in a function to the input component which you call from inside there. So how can we implement this? Let's start simple, and in the input component let's add a new function in a function, the change handler, which should trigger whenever the user enters something. We can simply bind this on our element, and therefore I will actually move it up here. We can bind this to our element here on both the input and the text area. So we can add on change here and point at the change handler. Do that on the text area and do that on the input. With that, this function will be called for every keystroke. That is when on change triggers. Now when that change handler is fired, we want to do two things. We want to store the value, just like that, and we want to validate it, as I mentioned. Now, when you're managing more than one state and the two states are kind of connected, you could use state and simply set up two states which you manage. That is absolutely fine. You're not limited to one. So we could manage the, let's say, entered value and have set entered value here, and then call use state and start with an empty value, and then replicate this and have the is valid and set is valid state here maybe, and start with false, and then you update both. You could do that, and it wouldn't be horrible, but often when you have two kind of connected states, and these states clearly are connected, the validity depends on the input value, then using a different hook is better. Use reducer. Use reducer also allows you to manage state in a component, and it also gives you a function you can call which updates the state and re-renders the component. But the difference to use state is that with use reducer, you can manage more complex state with ease. You can write some logic that basically runs whenever you want to change the state to do more complex updates than just set a new value. And therefore, use reducer is great whenever you have more complex state or you have interconnected state. So therefore, here I will use reducer. But how do we use it? Well, we call it like this, and then we have to pass in at least one argument. And that's a so-called reducer, hence the name. A reducer is really just a function which receives an action, which we can dispatch, and I'll show you how we dispatch an action in a second, and it receives the current state. And then we update the current state based on the action we received, return the new state, and use reducer will take that new state and give it back to us in the component and re-render everything. So we can run a more complex state updating logic. I'll set up the reducer function outside of my component because it does not depend on any component inputs, and I'll name it input reducer. Now it is just a function which gets two arguments, the current state and this action I was talking about. So we have this function here, and we pass the input reducer here to use reducer. In this function, we then always have to return a new state. And we can use a switch statement here, a vanilla JavaScript construct, to find out what action we have. Now it's up to you how we determine which action we have, but often you will dispatch actions that have a type property, which have a unique identifier that describes the action. And here we could wait for a change action, let's say, and it's totally up to us which identifier we use here. You could use any identifier. I'll wait for a change action, and then I will return a new state here, a new state object. The state here doesn't have to be an object, it could be anything, but in my case here it will be an object because it will merge multiple different state pieces into one grouped state. And I will return this if we have this change case. I will also provide a default case here where I return the existing unchanged state. In case we dispatch some action which we don't handle explicitly here, well then we'll just make it in here. So, what's this new state which I want to return here? First of all, I will create a copy of the old state so that we don't lose any data of the old state. And we can do that with the spread operator, the 3 dots, and then state. This copies the old state object and copies all key value pairs of that old object into this new object. And then we can override selected keys, selected properties. For example, value. Let's say we want to have a value property in our state. I will set it to action.val. And again, it's up to you how you pass that new value along with the action. I will store it in a val property on that action object, which I will eventually dispatch. There is one other state piece which we need to manage, and that is the isValid state, whether that input is valid or not. And now here we will have to run some validation logic. Now, for the moment, I'll just set it to true, but we'll replace this with the actual validation logic, which we just don't have yet, and I don't want to introduce too many new things simultaneously, so for the moment, let's hardcode this to true. So we have our simple reducer. We register it here with useReducer. useReducer also is able to take a second argument. It's optional though, and that can be an initial state you want to set up. So a state with which you want to initialize your component here. And there I want to have an object where value is set to an empty string, let's say, and where isValid is set to, let's say, false, so that initially the input is treated as false. And now this is my useReducer initialization. Now just like useState, useReducer returns something. And just like useState, it returns an array with exactly 2 elements. So just as with useState, we can use array destructuring here to get these 2 elements out of the returned array and store them in constants. And the 2 elements we always get from useReducer, no matter how we configured our reducer, is the current state, I will name it input state here, and a dispatch function which we can call. This is then how we will be able to dispatch actions to the reducer function, which will run through the function and return a new state, which will then update input state and re-render the component in the end. So, with that, in change handler, I of course wanna call dispatch. I want to dispatch to this reducer, and therefore here I pass an object which is such a action object. And here we in our code defined action to have a type and a val property. So we should make sure we provide these 2 pieces of information here. So type should be set to change, and here of course I want to use the exact same identifier I expect up there. So if you chose a different identifier, you have to use a different identifier down there as well. And I'll set val to event target value. Event is an object we get automatically on the change event, and event target is the input element on which this event was triggered, and value then simply is the value the user entered. With this, we are updating our state. Now to kind of reflect it, I will do 2 things. I will bind the value of input back to input state.value, so that we have this 2-way binding going on again. And I will do the same, of course, on text area, value to input state.value. By the way, in React, if you want to set the value on a text area, you don't set it here between the text area tags, as you might think. Instead, you do really set that value prop here. That is how you set the value of text area. And last but not least, to also have some extra feedback on whether this is valid or not, here below the element, I will check if input state is valid is false, hence the exclamation mark at the beginning. And if that is the case, I want to render some error text. And that error text should be settable from outside. So I will render props error text if that input is invalid. Now I also want to render a conditional class name here. So I will check here in my class name template literal. If input state is valid, is false, hence the exclamation mark at the beginning again. If that is the case, I will add a form-control-invalid class so that we add this extra class to the entire div if our input state is invalid, which it is initially. It only becomes valid after we type at least one character, because that is when I hard-code it to true. With that, let's go back to new place and use the input appropriately. Validators is not something we use yet, so passing in an empty array is okay. On input, we can't specify this yet, because at the moment we don't really have a mechanism of feeding the value and the input validity back to the parent component. But what we can and should provide here is an error text, which I'll here set to please enter a valid title. And with that, if we save this, we have an input which initially is invalid and therefore looks like this, but as soon as we type at least one character, it becomes valid. Now this never becomes invalid again because we have no real validation set up at the moment, but it generally works. We are able to type, we're able to change the validity initially, and that is not looking too bad. Now, of course, it would be kind of nice to have some real validation built in and to be able to really check, for example, if that's empty and so on.